Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
In the first half of 2020s, there was the crisis of COVID-19, the pandemic that plagued much of the world. And then unfolded the war between Russia and Ukraine. And shortly thereafter, Israel unleashed a war that the International Criminal Court, other organizations, governments around the world, independent humanitarian and human rights organizations labeled genocide. Against this background, the United Nations labeled the civil war in Sudan that started in April 2023, the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history. Much of the Western press deals with the civil war in the Sudan, a country just south of Egypt and bordering Libya, and to the east, of course, it has access to the Red Sea and a port there, the port of Sudan. The Western media labels this as a war between factions, two rival factions, the more official faction led by the General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan of the Sudanese armed forces, and supported by a number of governments, although as we will see, many governments play both sides of this civil war, but especially by the key sponsor, Saudi Arabia. And on the other side, there is General Hemdi of the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, primarily concentrated in the Darfur area, but also controls much of Darfur is under the Rapid Support Forces control, under Hemdi's control. Predominantly Christian, while the northern part, the Al-Burhan part, is predominantly Muslim. So this is presented in part as a Muslim Christian. The South also many tribal elements as well. But the Rapid Support Forces also have control of a number of lands along the border of Libya and Egypt. This is, again, as I pointed out, according to the United Nations, one of the worst humanitarian, if not the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history. And yet, not much attention has been paid to this, primarily because many in the West look at it as the issue between the Sudanese armed forces and Al-Burhan's forces and versus Hemdi's forces, the Rapid Support Forces, as a civil war, as a tribal issue. It's between factions, the northern part, Al-Burhan's predominantly Muslim, the southern predominantly Christian and tribal. So that's it, except that it isn't. This is a regional struggle behind which are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, on opposite ends, on opposite sides. The United Arab Emirates has had a short history of supporting rebel elements to gain influence, not just in the Sudan, but in Yemen, in Libya, in other parts of the Middle East and Africa. So this is not surprising. And to gain geopolitical influence as much as possible in the Red Sea. So it's reported, some reported that way, including some US media outlets, the and at the same time, the Western media argues, well, the West, Western Europe, and the United States are more or less innocent bystanders. Not innocent, exactly innocent as though they're doves, but they're not really that culpable, except that they are, because the arms provided to both sides come primarily from Western countries, to both sides, by the way, through Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Okay. So once again, what we see here is a power struggle for geopolitical control of East Africa, where China is also a player, including in the Sudan, and especially the port in the Red Sea. And so the matter becomes more complicated, despite the fact that the lingering civil war has cost several 100,000 lives, between 200 and 400,000, depending whose statistics you accept as credible. And of course, one of the worst humanitarian crisis, insofar as millions of people in a country of a population of 51 million, a country that is largely agrarian, only 36% are urban-based, the rest are in rural areas. This is a country that has suffered immensely. The economy has diminished as much as 80% of full capacity in comparison with 5 years ago as a result of the Civil War. And of course, the subterranean economy, as you would expect in Civil War conditions, meaning the underground economy, has thrived. And starvation on a mass scale, many people have seen, must have seen, well-known Hollywood movie stars doing advertisements asking for humanitarian assistance for the people in the Sudan, especially the Darfur region. The history of the Sudan is indeed the history of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, but all of the continent. The Sudan is, as I said, south of Egypt. The Nile River, of course, joins Egypt and the Sudan. In the early 19th century, as early as 1821, the Ottoman Empire and local Egyptian elites decided to take over Sudan. 1821 was a key year for the Ottoman Empire because there were rebels that were stirring trouble for independence in the southern Balkans, namely in Greece, but it was spreading. And so the Ottoman Empire went south and decided to consolidate power in Egypt and the Sudan. It held power in the Sudan until 1885, when Britain moved in. England reduced both the Sudan and Egypt into the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. Yes, the unfortunate term, condominium. For economic, geoeconomic, and of course geopolitical reasons, England wanted to control the Nile. It wanted access to the Red Sea. It wanted also the natural resources, agricultural resources, in the case of Egypt, especially cotton, but other agricultural resources from both of these colonies that it had. And England held the Sudan until 1855, 1856, actually, officially. Except that that year that the Sudan achieved its independence, the first civil war broke out. In fact, amid the independence movement of 1855, a civil war breaks out, and it lasted until the end of the first Nixon administration in 1972. It is estimated that between 500,000, actually up to 1 million people died in that first civil war. In that one too, the hand of local elements, but local elites, but even more important, of England, the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia was also visible. They had the hand in that as well. So there were external factors in that first civil war. The second civil war that broke out started in 1983, and it lasted until 2005. That was even more deadly, as twice as many fatalities resulted from that. And as a result of that, Sudan was so debilitated by the time that the Arab Spring, the Afro Arab Spring erupted in 2011. We have the secessionist elements, again with a hand of regional players, also Europeans in this, making sure that the southern part of Sudan, called South Sudan, one of the poorest countries in the world, just like Sudan is one of the poorest countries in the world, breaks off. So in 2011, one of the results of the civil war debilitating Sudan is that South Sudan becomes a sovereign nation. And then, of course, there is the third civil war of 2023 to the present, the one that has an estimate, again, estimates run wild, from 200,000 to 400,000 fatalities, as well as some 13 million of 51 million people displaced and scattered regionally as well as internally displaced. The question is, of course, why has this happened? It is no accident when you look at armed conflicts today. Overwhelmingly, they are concentrated in the global south, and within the global south, most of them in Africa. There are agencies, there are organizations that keep statistics that list anywhere from 100 to 130 such armed conflicts, with 59 active ones. Sudan is at the top of the list. And they are, as I said, they are mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Middle East. This is not an accident. This is the area that is vulnerable to destabilization by Western Europeans, the United States, at a time that China has been making inroads economically for economic integration in the Middle East and in Africa. It is no secret that African governments, one after another in the last 10 years, have been lining up behind China. China has a role in the Sudan. China is not using, as the West, as the NATO countries, the West, the G7, in other words, they do not use, United States, Western Europe primarily, do not use military means as leverage. They do not use that to secure market share, to secure geopolitical and geoeconomic advantages in Sudan. They go in with trade, and they go in with infrastructural development projects and social development. That is their approach. That is their model of development, not using the Air Force and the Navy to go into other countries and to threaten military action and to destabilize through covert operations, regime change operations. That's the domain of the West, not China. The US has made it very clear, first and foremost, especially under Trump, that it wants to contain China. Containing China is part of the problem, whether in Africa or in Latin America, at least this administration, the Trump administration, this is 2026, has made it very clear that It doesn't want any Latin American country, any country in the Western Hemisphere, having much to do with China. Okay? It is the same policy, except that they can't do much, as much outside of the Western Hemisphere as they can do within the Western Hemisphere, although that power is limited. As Henry Kissinger used to say, there are limits to the power of the great powers. So there are limits to what the US can accomplish in Africa. But destabilization comes in many forms. One form is playing both sides of this civil war, as we will see, and they have, by the way, while claiming to want peace and to want justice and to want fairness and to want democracy and freedom. Things, by the way, they don't allow their own population. Let's face it, the way things have turned out, they and the record speaks for itself as far as regime change operations, the history of that. The fact is that the hand of the great powers is in here. Let me make it very clear that China is not in Africa, whether in East Africa, in Sudan, or in Southern Africa, or anywhere in Northern Africa, in Islamic Africa. It's not there for humanitarian purposes. It is there in order to conduct trade, in order to economically integrate these countries under its aegis. No doubt about that. China is aiming to continue on the road of becoming the undisputed hegemonic power economically, in the economic domain. The US is in the military domain of the world. So it's not compromising on that. And the US doesn't have the economic leverage that China has. So it uses strategic leverage, it uses economic leverage, and it uses third powers like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates. It uses other regional players in order to exert influence in Africa, especially in East Africa, in this case, in the Sudan. Now, I want to point out that the history of the Sudan is, as a society, is an unfortunate one in the post-colonial era, not just because it has been characterized, as I delineated from the very beginning, by 3 successive civil wars with intervals of peace in between, but because it has been unable to overcome the underdevelopment that the West, namely the British, imposed on the country, namely reducing it to an exporter of raw materials and an importer of finished products. And the importer of raw materials means that on the terms of trade that Britain, that London decided, not Sudan. And this applies to all of Africa. So when we look at the economic model of Africa, when you study the economic history of Africa, what you find is, from the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade going back 400 years to the present, is, including the post-colonial period, is that the scholars, Western, non-Western alike, African scholars included, are well aware of this. The uneven terms of trade benefit the industrialized countries of the West to the detriment of the countries in Africa and the global South. It also means imposing on Africa a model of external dependency. And this model is true to the present. The only precious thing in Africa is people and raw materials. Cheap labor the cheapest on this planet, by the way. This is the continent with the lowest living standards. This is the continent with the poorest countries in the world, okay? Sudan and South Sudan being two of those poorest countries in the world, okay? And yet they are rich. Africa as a country is very rich in natural resources and has enormous potential to develop and become self-sufficient. The key here for the Sudan, for all of Africa, is self-sufficiency. Who has blocked self-sufficiency historically other than the colonial West and then the post-colonial, again, Western powers, including the United States, but now we add, of course, China into the mix, which has a different relationship other than the patron-client model, as many scholars call it. In other words, the traditional model of the hegemonic post-colonial power going in and dictating terms and providing the worst possible terms of trade and financing for projects to the recipient country, to the African country. This is on a scale all over Africa, by the way. Okay. So this is not just Sudan. Sudan has the potential because it has many precious mineral resources, including gold, many precious mineral resources, natural resources, to become to have a much higher living standard for its people. It's just 51 million people, 52, somewhere in there, and to become much more self-sufficient. But the local elites, okay, the local elites, the regional governments, and then the great powers, rivalry for control of the assets and geopolitical control of the Sudan has exacerbated the problems that they face internally in overcoming centuries of colonial control and underdevelopment in the process. Because Africa, contrary to the myth in the West, they were always underdeveloped. Africa was undeveloped, not underdeveloped. There's a huge difference in economics, by the way. Underdeveloped is a process like development. The systematic process of making the economy externally dependent and less sufficient and imposing on them upon them the purchase of finished products from the West at a high cost, value-added products, while they sell raw materials cheaply at low prices, okay? And valuing their labor very low, hence low living standards, okay? So what we have is indeed a Sudan with huge problems, socioeconomic problems, with very few people in the middle class. Sudan does not have, like much of Africa, much of a middle class, like France or the United States. Far from it. Most people are indeed impoverished. More than 3/4 of the population, okay? And most people are young, under 30. They don't have the same demographics reflected as a developed country. This also is the legacy of colonialism and the continued exploitation of Sudan in the post-colonial period. When we look at the Sudan and the civil war since April 23 today, we are struck by the fact that it seems that both sides claim to be representing the people, and that their sponsors behind them claim, and as especially Western countries, that they want freedom and democracy, especially Western countries. That the rebel groups, either of them, is about indeed popular sovereignty and freedom and democracy. Actually, these two generals that have been going against each other, these two rebel groups that have been going against each other, they were partners before in 2019, when a revolution broke out, overthrew the government, and the people of Sudan demanded popular sovereignty and democracy. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and General Hamdi, who are now rivals, General Hamdi, head of the Rapid Support Forces, Burhan, head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, these people were collaborators. And they collaborated in 2019 in order to suppress a democratic freedom, a popular sovereignty freedom aimed at social justice and economic justice and into corruption. There's enormous corruption. Needless to say, there's corruption even in the West, and that's not a surprise, but there is enormous corruption, obviously, here. So they collaborated to suppress the grassroots democratic aspirations that took their signal from the Afro-Arab Spring movement of 2011. The inspiration came from them, from that. So there are scholars, not many, but there are scholars around the world who have studied the civil war of Sudan and view it not as a civil war where on the one side there is the pro-Saudi, repressive, authoritarian rebel group versus the democratic. There is no such thing. Both are counter-revolutionary. Indeed, this is the curious thing about the Sudan civil war today in the last 3 years, and that is it is a counter-revolutionary movement. Neither side represents the people. Neither side represents democracy. Neither side represents social justice. Neither side represents popular sovereignty. And the forces behind them at the regional level, especially the two main sponsors who are rivals regionally and aim at regional hegemony to determine the balance of power in the Red Sea and in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, rivaled on the other side by Iran, and of course Israel also in there, with strange alliances and alignments, I should say, not alliances, but alignments through the United Arab Emirates. This struggle is not about democracy. It is counter-revolutionary, and it is about exploitation of the natural resources, the geopolitical status of Sudan and the Red Sea, and about the exploitation of the labor of not just Sudan and not just East Africa, but all of Africa. Given what happened with the United States, by the way, cutting off Somalia completely, not that the United States, as we will see, when we look at the issue of the humanitarian aid, and I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of advertisements on television and newspapers, the internet, famous people asking help out, and they should, by the way, and that's a good thing, and that's rightly so, because the United Nations aid to the Sudan, which has the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, has been reduced completely, and it only covers, I think, 10 to 15% of the needs. The United States, especially under Trump, cut aid severely. In some African countries, eliminated it completely. Somalia is one of them. So what we have, but Western Europe followed suit. Western Europe, the Europeans follow suit. So what we have here is a crisis that's manufactured. They have no problem, these same countries, these same governments that cut off aid, they have no problem selling weapons on a mass scale to continue to feed the civil war while proclaiming they're in favor of democracy and freedom in Sudan. They have been selling weapons indirectly through Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. Okay, some of the weapons get through Egypt and Libya, some from Iran through Yemen, but the main sponsors, again, and like I said, some Western press have more recently, in the last few weeks, presented this more or less as a struggle regionally, although that was way too simplistic, between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates struggling to control Sudan and East Africa, and actually chunks of Africa. Okay, not that simple. The great powers are also involved. The U.S. doesn't want China there. Just like the U.S. made no apologies about not wanting China's presence anywhere in the entire hemisphere. If they can get rid of it completely, they would. Of course, they can. But the goal is containment of China by the United States, okay? But because the United States has turned on its own allies, it did turn on its own allies in 2025 and it continues in 2026. This is first day of February 2026. Some of the Western European countries are evaluating their options on how they should handle, but the situation, the destabilization of the Middle East and Africa issue, because they have been destabilizing, they have been feeding the civil wars from the first one to the second to the third to this one now. They have been examining that, given that their own partner, their own main partner, the leader of the pack, the United States, turned on them. They have been reevaluating. Where that leads, we have to wait and see. And they have been looking at China. And China, as I said, is not in this for its spiritual salvation. It's in this for tangible benefits. China wants market share and it wants raw materials on the cheap too. Okay, China has a goal. However, the deals they offer on the table, the deals they put on the table, which include social development, are much better. Schools, hospital, roads, ports, and so forth, they're much better than whatever the West has been offering, which are ridiculous terms of trade, very low prices for raw materials, and the installation of military bases to launch operations against their axis of evil enemies. Iran is at the top of the list on this one, by the way. So this has been part of the problem. Now, in the country, inside Sudan, there has been a crisis of enormous, and I'm sure people have seen on television or on YouTube or other outlets, Al Jazeera TV or whatever, what have you. People have seen the men, women, children in tents. Let me point out that according to the United Nations, the population most severely affected are women and children. Okay. So when the US and Europe cut aid to Africa, they are cutting aid to women and children. Okay. Again, the population of Sudan is roughly 51, 52 million, somewhere in there. Two-thirds of them have a status of some sort of refugee status, internally displaced, or they have left, refugees, asylum seekers, and so forth. There are reports that roughly half, some reports state more than that, are suffering from a severe food shortage. Again, that percentage, nearly from 40 to nearly 50%, also have no access at all to any sort of medical care. I reiterate, the United Nations only covers a small percent of what the humanitarian needs are. This means that the economy rests on a barter style trading. I'll give you bread for eggs, and that's that sort of thing. It is indeed a subterranean, much of the economy is subterranean economy. The annual income is estimated at under $600. This is one of the worst situations on the planet, and it is a situation where it is not. Although in the last few months there have been signals from the Sudan, from Khartoum, from the capital, that they want to reach a deal. There has been no such deal. Many look at this as the problem of the United Nations, that it is indeed a reflection that the United Nations is not functioning well. The United Nations itself, just recently, the Secretary General of the United Nations came out and said, well, we are a reflection of our members. Many of their members are not paying their dues. The United Nations Secretary General issued the alarm bell that they're not paying dues, and that in the next 6 months they're going to have problems meeting their needs on a world scale. The United Nations operates all over the world. But there are critics who argue that the United Nations has failed all this time to end the conflict in the Sudan. Now, if the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Turkey is involved in this, by the way, Libya is involved in this, Egypt is involved in this, United Arab Emirates are involved in this, if they are not cooperating for a solution to end the humanitarian crisis, which, again, the worst on the planet, and one of the worst, if not the worst, in modern history, if they're not cooperating, the United Nations, just an organization that simply reflects the collective decisions of its, at least the majority of its members, and especially the Security Council, the most powerful members. If they are not going to go along, then of course Secretary General Guterres is right. What is he going to do? He's powerless. Then they turn around, the United States among the first, undermine the United Nations by dropping out of sub-agencies of the UN, not paying their dues. And then they claim, well, see how weak the United Nations is? Of course, you're not even paying the dues. You drop out of the sub-agencies. You don't recognize them. Criticizing the World Health Organization for its vaccine, for its role in the pandemic, and so forth, or criticizing the United Nations rapporteur in Palestine. So the issue of, is the United Nations to blame for the Sudan, is an important issue. The fact is, the United Nations ought to solve crises like this. This is what it's there for. However, if there are individual governments, especially the great powers, but also regional powers, that are actively feeding the civil war, there is nothing that the United Nations can do. The other issue that analysts who have written about this point to is that this is an issue between Islam versus Christianity, and Islam in the north, Christianity in the south, and the various tribal elements in the south, of course, especially in the Darfur region. It isn't, by the way. Religion has historically been used from the English Civil War of the 1640s, when Lord Cromwell used it against the Catholic Irish, by the way, as a pretext to snatch the best lands from some of the wealthy Irish people. Religion has historically been used to camouflage and to articulate at the same time differences, but it's not the cause, it's a pretext. Okay? The cause is the desire to acquire market share, natural resources, and geopolitical status. That is at the heart of this. And by local elites to see who gets to manage the country, who is in control of the country. A religion is simply a tool to mobilize the masses, whether in the United States today, by the way, okay, or in Darfur. It's a tool. It has been used as a tool to mobilize the masses around a cause, a political cause. There are also arguments, analysts who have said that this is really the United States can't do anything except go along with whatever peace proposals have been advanced. Well, this conceals the fact that the United States has been an active, and we see this in an active salesman of arms, massive arms transfers. And we have seen this, by the way, in congressional testimony in the Armed Services Committee, when there are Democrats who ask, elected officials who ask, congressmen who ask the question, why is there such massive transfer of arms to Saudi Arabia and to the United Arab Emirates? Obviously, it stimulates the military-industrial complex in the United States. It stimulates Wall Street, at least a segment of Wall Street. But those weapons are used in Yemen and in Sudan and in regional conflicts, okay? So the provider, the facilitator of the crisis behind the the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi conflict in the Middle East and in Africa, the providers are Western Europeans and the United States. The providers of weapons are those. They know full well what they're doing. And in many cases, they provide weapons to both sides because they sell to these two respective countries regionally. Okay? The net loser, the only loser in this case, are the people of Sudan. And all of this so that companies of the respective players, the governments, can go in and secure contracts for various natural resources and to secure the advantage geopolitically and deny it to China. Okay. The question, of course, of another question that has been raised in scholarship with regard to the Sudan is, why is it that it's happening there? And why is it that the global South has civil wars? There must be something about the people. There must be something about the culture. There must be something about the traditions. That's not true at all. All of this has been taking place because of the legacy of colonialism the military interventionist legacy. Colonialism was brutal. It was militarist, by the way. They ruled with an iron hand. And then the post-military, the post-colonial, which continued to feed the civil wars in the case of the Sudan, but across Africa and the global south. It is no accident that many countries in the global west do not have civil wars, although the United States is approaching that mark internally, entirely of its own doing, not that anybody else is interfering. But it is amazing that much of this civil conflict, this civil war, these conflicts are in the global south historically, from Truman to the present, and not in the global west, not in the advanced capitalist countries. One reason is because they are advanced capitalist countries. They have a much higher living standards. They don't have widespread poverty. They have a sizable middle class. They have socio-political stability because they have possibilities of socioeconomic upward mobility. The global south does not. Okay. The other thing the global south does not have is that the global south does not have the luxury of the global west, which did not have conquerors on its soil. It did not have and I will underscore this because it's in much of the scholarship of especially a theory called dependency theory. The dependency theory, of which, by the way, I have published books on this as well, it stresses the issue of historical dependency as an underlying cause, as a root cause of the condition of the global south from colonialism to post-colonial times to the present. This is a serious issue. This was not the case in Western Europe, in the United States, in Japan. This was not the case in these countries, in the G7. It was the case in the Sudan. It was the case throughout the global south. It is no accident that there is a correlation between conflict, political conflict, breaking out into civil war, and dim prospects for socioeconomic development when there are few domestic elites, regional and global actors vying for control of natural resources, market share, and exploitation of labor historically. And market equilibrium is absent. Socioeconomic equilibrium is absent in these countries. So this is a very important issue. The crisis in the Sudan is a counter-revolution. It is part of a global, and I'm going to close with this issue because it's very important. We are facing in the entire world a counter-revolution today. It doesn't stem particularly from President Trump. He inherited it. Trump is a manifestation of the counter-revolution. Behind this administration and behind the administrations, the governments in Europe, in the G7 country, are elites that are vying for control of market share on a world scale, no different than it was during the late 19th century when the German elites sought the same thing. And they went after market share in Africa when Africa was carved out and a war broke out in South Africa, the so-called Boer War, and behind it was Germany on one side and England on the other. And eventually that presaged, as the brilliant English scholar John Hobson pointed out, World War I. It presaged the Great War. They didn't call it World War I because they didn't naturally expect the second one to break out, the Great War, a global war. We are at a junction of counter-revolution, and the counter-revolution is on a world scale, and its genesis, it may seem like it's a global south. It's small countries like Sudan, this small, impoverished country where millions of people are starving, and the world has been ignoring them because it's focused on everything from the pandemic to the Ukrainian war to the genocide. Nobody has done much about the Ukrainian war and the genocide in Gaza, but it's largely ignored Sudan and sub-Saharan Africa. But the genesis of this is the West. The genesis of this are also regional elites seeking market share and seeking power at that level to determine the regional balance of power in the Middle East and in Africa. I want to thank you for listening. By all means, join this channel. Write questions, write comments, ask questions. I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much.